Good day. I've been talking for some time about how we are in effect in a global crisis with Ukraine at the center of that crisis, and this remains true. But I'm afraid it's also increasingly looking as if we may be heading towards a second front in this global crisis with more issues, more problems, with a new area of conflict over Taiwan. Now, I'm going to defer that to the later part of this program, a brief discussion about the latest developments there and where the situation appears to be heading, except, of course, that I will again repeat my dismay that this is so. I will say this: it seems that people who are the decision makers in Washington seem to have learnt nothing from the Ukraine debacle. The same set of mistakes are being made with China over Taiwan. And I would quickly add, before I get to the topics in discussion on this program, that of course if we do have a second front over Taiwan looming in the next few weeks, make absolutely no mistake, that will become the main front in this crisis. Ukraine will at that point cease to be its center. It will become a sideshow. Anyway, let's deal first with what is still the major area of conflict, and that is Ukraine. And over the last couple of hours, we've been getting very clear indications that the situation in Donbass is now at a critical point, and that the Ukrainian position there is now coming under enormous stress. The first thing to say is that we are getting more reports. They're now starting to get more, shall we say, they're crystallizing, they're becoming harder, but these reports, which used to be tentative, are now becoming more, not just plausible, but all but confirmed, that the Russians have indeed successfully broken through the defense lines that the Ukrainians created opposite Donetsk city. Donetsk city being, of course, firmly under the control of the Donetsk People's Republic, but the Ukrainians had established a very heavily fortified defense line opposite Donetsk city. That is now cracking. I think we can say that without any dispute. There's information that the Russians have reached and are in the process of capturing a village, perhaps more properly a small town called Krasnogorovka, which is actually some way behind the front lines, and that they are also launching an attack in the direction of another settlement called Pesky, which is very much a part of this front line. So it looks as if a major hole has been punched through this defense line, and that the Russians are gradually in the process of breaking it down, putting it in a situation where the Ukrainians may have little option either to retreat or to face potential encirclement. Now, I say that the Ukrainians have not so far shown any indication of doing either thing. On the contrary, they seem to be rushing reinforcements to try to hold this line, and in fact they seem to be throwing into this line some of their best troops. There was reports that a military formation called the President of Ukraine Brigade, which, well, I don't know much about it. It could be a kind of Praetorian Guard formation, I suppose, but its title suggests that it is a high-status formation within the Ukrainian military, that has been rushed to the front lines, but that the train, which was deploying some of its troops, or perhaps all of its troops, to this frontline area in opposite Donetsk, was attacked by Russian missiles at the railway station at Krasnoarmeysk, that hundreds of soldiers of this brigade were killed as a result of that missile strike, and that the brigade lost all of its armoured vehicles. Of course, again, once more, I can't confirm it. This is reports from the Russians. But when it comes to missile strikes on Ukrainian units, the Russians seem to be fairly well informed about where those units are, and their reports have turned out in the end to be fairly reliable. But the key thing is that the Ukrainians seem to be trying to send reinforcements, rush reinforcements to this part of the front line. That is cracking, and the front line continues to crack, and these reinforcements are taking heavy punishment, and one has to wonder to what extent the Ukrainians are going to be able to keep reinforcing this front line instead of either withdrawing from it or perhaps facing a comprehensive defeat if they try to defend it. And a little further north, we're also getting information that the Russians and their allies from the DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic, the militia, are now definitely closing in on the important city of Bakhmut. It seems that nearly all of the villages around Bakhmut, or at least to the east and south of Bakhmut, have been captured by the Russians. There's talk that the Russians are now just 2 kilometers away from the city itself. And there's also reports now of street fighting, more news of street fighting going on in Soledar, which is perhaps best understood as a suburb of Bakhmut, which is to the north of the main urban agglomeration, which represents Bakhmut itself. Interestingly and curiously, the Russians seem to be making no attempt for the moment to storm Siversk, that town in the north of Donetsk region, which for a time looked like it would be the epicenter of the battle. Now, I'm going to make a suggestion, which is that I think this is very much in keeping with Russian tactics across the fighting in Donbass. The Russians deal out hammer blows against every part of a Ukrainian, of whatever Ukrainian front line they come up against. They launch heavy artillery strikes against this front line. They then discover which is the weakest point in that front line, and it turned out in the case of the latest one, the one from Siversk in the north to Bakhmut in the south, that the weakest point was the area around the Uglegorsk thermal power station, and in the area, the southern precincts of Bakhmut city. So instead of wasting time with battles in other places where the Ukrainians seem to be more strongly positioned, like Siversk, they then focus their energies in exploiting that point of weakness, the area to the south of Bakhmut, the Uglegorsk power station, which has now been captured, and other places south and east of Bakhmut city, and Soledar as well, which have all either been captured or are in the process of being stormed. And Siversk, which was attracting all that attention about 2 weeks ago, has been left to look after itself. In other words, the Russians reinforce success. If they come up against very strong resistance, as apparently they did at Siversk, the Ukrainians withdrew to the heights around the city. They rushed reinforcements there. They were able to entrench themselves rather than bang their heads against this until eventually they break through. After experiencing losses, the Russians instead just let this part of the front line go to sleep, if one could put it like that, and focus their energies on where they are achieving the breakthrough. And we see this further south in the Donetsk front lines. The Russians hammered away over the last couple of days at various parts of the Donetsk front line, and eventually they found the weak spot and they found it in the areas of Krasnogorovka and Pesky, and they're now exploiting it. And that doesn't mean that other parts of this front line aren't opposite Donetsk aren't also coming under attack, but you can see that the Russians are in the process of exploiting the breakthrough that they are achieving there. Meanwhile, we're getting reports of interesting developments on other fronts. Firstly, the Institute for the Study of War, this institute based in Washington, D.C., which publishes information from an extremely pro-Ukrainian perspective, and which seems to be largely dominated by members of the Kagan-Nuland family. Anyway, this, perhaps unintentionally, using various techniques, actually was able to find that Russian troops are, as I understand it, even closer to Kharkiv city than earlier reports had suggested. But perhaps a more interesting development on that front is that there is now an accumulation of reports of a very big build-up of Russian armor on the Russian side of the border opposite Kharkiv region. Now, it's important to say that Kharkiv region is obviously a large region. You could build up your forces, these armored forces, for a major push if you were intending to attack Kharkiv city. But it's also possible that what the Russians are doing is they're building up their armored forces, that they're going to then channel them through ETHEREUM to the south once the situation in Donbass has collapsed, and that the purpose of these armored forces might be for a much bigger offensive during August, perhaps heading all the way towards the Dnieper River. Well, we'll have to see. I should stress that all these reports about this Russian build-up derive from two sources. They derive from satellite data, which Western analysts are now starting to pick up, but they also, I have to say this, they also reflect internet chatter that is coming from, if you like, the Russian side. And at the same time as all this is happening, we see constant Russian missile strikes across Ukraine. And the British Ministry of Defence has now said that some of these missile strikes are coming from Belarus, from the territory of Belarus, which again seems to suggest some moves towards supporting a northern front of some kind, which might be consistent with this build-up opposite Kharkiv region. And we've also heard of a significant build-up of Russian forces in Kherson region. These appear to be principally airborne forces. They seem to consist largely of the 106th Airborne Guards Division, which the Russians have deployed from the city of Tula. This is, by the way, very much an elite division within the Russian military. It could be intended to counter this Ukrainian offensive on Kherson region that we've been hearing so much about, of which, by the way, there is still little sign. We'll come to that in a moment. Or, alternatively, it might be preparing the ground for some kind of Russian advance, some Russian offensive towards Nikolaev. And Nikolaev, this port city on the Black Sea, lying between Kherson and Odessa, once one of the major shipbuilding centers of the Imperial Russian Navy, and then after that of the Soviet fleet. That was where the Soviets were building their aircraft carriers in the 1970s and 1980s. Nikolaev, or Mykolaiv as the Ukrainians call it, has now been the target of extremely heavy Russian missile strikes, one of which, by the way, killed a Ukrainian businessman who was a known political ally of the former president Petro Poroshenko. Now, these missile strikes on Nikolaev, I will call it Nikolaev, have been going on for some time, for a long time. It's not entirely clear what their purpose is, but they do seem to be intended to disrupt Ukrainian headquarters in this part of Ukraine, and also to soften Ukrainian defenses there. Now, this is a little strange because the major Ukrainian military concentrations, which are supposed to be used for this Ukrainian advance on Kherson region, are not actually located in Nikolaev. They appear to be located further north in an industrial city known as Kryvyi Rog, which is in a different part of this front line near close to Kherson region. But though the Russians do launch missile strikes on those Ukrainian formations around Kryvyi Rog, it is Nikolaev that seems to be their major target. And that begs a number of questions. Is this Russian build-up in Kherson region intended to defend Kherson region from these Ukrainian troops concentrated on Kryvyi Rog, or are these heavy Russian missile strikes towards Nikolaev intended to pave the way for a Russian offensive towards Nikolaev and perhaps further on towards Odessa? And is it possible that these missile strikes are part of that, and that this build-up of Russian forces in Kherson region actually has an offensive as opposed to a defensive role? Well, the Russian General Staff doesn't share its plans with me, so I have no way of knowing one way or another. What I would say is that there was apparently another attempt by the Ukrainians to cross the Ingulets River, again in the area to the north. Military units which ultimately have their origin in Kryvyi Rog were deployed south to try and cross the Ingulets River. They were rapidly detected by the Russians, came under a tank and artillery assault, and the Ukrainians again were driven back with heavy losses. So it's not so far looking as if this Ukrainian offensive is achieving very much. And there are rumours, and always one has to reiterate these are just rumours, that the overall commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, General Zaluzny, has now informed Zelensky that he doesn't want to have anything to do with this Kherson offensive. He thinks it's an extremely bad idea, and that he's in fact pressing to have it cancelled because he wants to use whatever forces Ukraine still has in a more defensive role. Is this true? Is this not? Is this untrue? Is it just Russian disinformation, which it might very well be, by the way? Again, how can I say? But it's plausible, and the Ukrainians don't go out of their way to deny it, and the fact that they failed to deny it gives, shall we say, more mileage to this story, which is surprising if it is untrue. Anyway, there we are. For the moment, we aren't seeing much sign of an offensive, a Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region, but we are getting increasing amount of evidence of a major Russian strike coming in and through Donbass, of Ukrainian resistance in Donbass now facing almost overwhelming pressure, and of a major armoured punch being assembled by the Russians to be used, well, we're not quite sure where exactly. Now, there's a major development, something of political as opposed to military nature, which may suggest that we are looking now at a major crisis in Donbass, that the Ukrainians are starting to think that it will no longer be possible for them to hold on to Donbass for much further, which is that the Ukrainian government has now issued an order, and it is an order mandating, making compulsory, the evacuation of all civilians from Donetsk region, that part of Donetsk region which Ukraine still controls. That means that Ukrainians, that people, civilians in Bakhmut city, in Siversk, in Solidar, in Slavyansk, in Kramatorsk, all of these places are now under orders to leave. They are required to leave. Now, there's a huge amount of speculation about why this is the case. The German newspaper Die Welt, which I should say takes a very strongly pro-Ukrainian view, says that this is a humanitarian move to try to protect civilians at a time of intensifying fighting in Donbass. And that may very well be the case. But there is an alternative view that it is a sign that the Ukrainians expect to lose all of Donetsk region and all of Donbass very soon, and are trying to relocate the population to basically leave the Russians with empty cities, with a shell, if you like. Well, all I would say is that I'm not going to guess that the latter is true. All I would say is, however, that if it is true, the Ukrainians need to be very careful, because forced relocation of civilian populations can, in certain circumstances, amount to a war crime. And if it is indeed the intention to evacuate people or to remove people from a certain area in order to deny a population to the other side, well, that starts to come close to war crimes territory. I'm not, by the way, saying it would necessarily be a war crime. It would be a war crime if it were done by an occupier. Ukraine will argue that it is not an occupier, that it is the legitimate authority. But as I said, it's starting to come closer to that point. And of course, you can mandate this, but if you start to use force to carry through with that order, then of course it begins to become increasingly problematic. And as I said, the Ukrainians need to be careful about what they're doing. As people who follow me will understand, I'm choosing my words extremely carefully. Whilst we are on the subject of crimes and possible war crimes, both Ukraine and Russia have asked for independent investigations of the attack, the military strike, the rocket strike on the prisoner of war camp in the Donetsk region, which resulted in the deaths of 53 Ukrainian prisoners of war, mainly apparently from the Azov battalion. And the Russians have formally requested an investigation by the relevant UN agencies and by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Well, I hope there is an independent investigation. I'm far from confident that there will be, even with all of these requests. Let's wait and see what does happen. But anyway, coming back to that point about this evacuation order, I have to say that regardless of what Ukrainian motivations are, whether it is to protect civilians, and I would say again that a responsible government would take steps to try to get civilians out of harm's way. Whether this is the right way to do it is another question. But anyway, whatever the intention behind this evacuation order, the fact that it has been made and the scale of the evacuation that is being discussed, there's talk that it's going to involve more than 200,000 people, including 60,000 children, does not suggest confidence on the part of Ukraine that it can hold on to Donbass and hold on to Donetsk region. It reinforces the overwhelming impression that Ukraine is losing its last footholds in the Donbass, in Donetsk region, and is preparing to pull out, or is preparing for the possibility that it may be forced out. And the fact that this order has been made now may suggest that the Ukrainian leadership is getting more and more information from its frontline commanders, from presumably General Zaluzny and the Ukrainian High Command, that we are in the last stages of the Battle of Donbass, that the ability of the Ukrainian army to go on holding out in Donbass in the face of this overwhelming Russian offensive, this vast offensive with artillery forces and all of that, that the Ukrainian army's ability to withstand that offensive is now almost exhausted, and that trying to do so risks losing huge numbers of troops, in killed and wounded and potentially captured, and that Ukraine simply can't afford to do that anymore. I would say this, in my opinion, the Battle of Donbass remains the single most important battle of the Donbass war. Of the Ukraine war, if the Russians clear Donbass, I've never myself had any doubts that eventually they would do, but if they're able to capture Donbass, the better part of the Ukrainian army will have suffered massive losses, and there is no other area of Ukraine, except possibly parts of Kiev and perhaps the immediate area around Odessa city, which is remotely comparable to Donbass in terms of the ability to create fortifications and defense lines there. Donbass, because of its very high population densities, at least by Ukrainian standards, its highly urbanized character, the fact that there's a large number of heavy industrial facilities located there, is defendable like no other part of Ukraine is. And if Donbass comes under Russian control, personally, I do not see how the Ukrainians could continue to hold on to places like Zaporozhye city, and even Kharkiv itself starts to look extremely vulnerable. Anyway, that's my view of the current situation in Ukraine. I will just finish with one last point. Even as they're thrown back in Kherson, even as they're suffering massive losses in Donbass, even as the situation on the Donetsk front lines looks increasingly grim, and even as we get news of this heavy Russian build-up, this big Russian build-up on the Russian side of the border, but opposite Kharkiv region, what looks like an armored fist being put together for the decisive punch. Even as all of this is going on, Ukraine has hit back. They have launched a drone attack on the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Now, it needs to be said that this drone attack was carried out by a small commercial drone. The amount of explosives used was very limited, and it appears to have done only superficial damage, though some people within the building, the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, do seem to have suffered some injuries, though it seems none of them is under any danger of losing their life or anything like that. Now, it's easy to dismiss or ridicule this sort of thing. It's clearly only a minor pinprick. There's 2 points to be made about it. First of all, this drone attack was clearly carried out from within Crimea itself, which shows that Ukraine still has some kind of functioning intelligence operation within Crimea, which is something that must cause the Russians very considerable concern. I say that because everybody who's studied this incident accepts that this small commercial drone could not have reached Sevastopol from Ukrainian-held territory. So it demonstrates that the Ukrainians still have an intelligence organization and supporters, some people who are some kind of network of supporters in Crimea, and that will concern the Russians. But the other thing is that this incident, minor as it may seem, minor as it is in terms of the general force of events in Ukraine, also has a psychological effect. It reminds people that Ukraine is still in the fight. It's forced the Russians to postpone their Navy Day celebrations in Sevastopol, which is a big event in Sevastopol, and it is for the Russians an embarrassment. So it should not be completely discounted. It should not be ridiculed. It was, in its small way, a success. Now, that brings me perhaps to one very last point, which is that I've had a rather interesting and actually very informative email, the essential nature of which I've been able to check, but it's from a viewer, correspondent. I'm not going to disclose this person's identity. I've not had permission from this person to do it. But this person has made the point that this figure that the US defense intelligence community of 75,000 Russian casualties that they've just been publishing and which has been doing the rounds is in fact easily deconstructed. A few days before, the CIA director, Mr. Burns, said that the Russians had that 15,000 Russian soldiers had been killed during the 5 months of the war. Now, on the standard ratio of 4 wounded for every dead soldier, 4 times 15 is 60, plus 15 makes 75. So this is simply an extrapolation from that guesstimate of 15,000 dead Russians. The CIA has simply multiplied that number by 4 using the standard ratio of wounded to dead and added the 2 figures, the guesstimate of 15,000 dead Russians to this calculation of likely wounded Russians, and they've come up with that figure of 75,000. Well, that already looks a bit shaky, but of course, and this person is absolutely right, that figure of 15,000 dead Russians is a figure that the US defense community was circulating at the end of March. It hasn't increased since then. So it would appear that if you believe these numbers, that the Russians have not suffered any casualties, or at least no dead Russian soldiers, since the end of March. Now that is of course absurd, but it does what it does do is that it gives one little confidence in any of these casualty figures about dead Russians that one sees floating around. The CIA, the US intelligence community, I must assume, have more accurate figures than these, but clearly they're not publishing them, and they're coming up with these numbers, which in and of themselves mean not so much little as absolutely nothing. Anyway, let's move on now to that other crisis, which is the crisis over Taiwan and over Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Now, Pelosi's office has now issued her itinerary, details of her itinerary, and Taiwan is not on it. So it's possible that this idea of a trip to Taiwan has been called off, but I wouldn't put any money on it if I was a gambling man. It could just be that Pelosi and US officials, aware of this strengthening Chinese reaction, are keeping the Chinese guessing, and they don't want the Chinese to know yet whether or not Pelosi does intend to visit Taiwan. And of course, it's entirely possible that we're going to learn about Pelosi's visit to Taiwan after it's actually ended. In other words, Pelosi will fly into Taiwan, meet with Taiwanese leaders, and then say whatever she wants, then fly out again, and then we'll get the TV pictures and the confirmations that she was actually there. So it could be that this is what is being prepared. But at the same time, as all of this is happening, we are now seeing growing signs of a build-up, both by the Chinese and by the Americans. And by a build-up, I want to make it very clear, I mean a military build-up. And we've heard about the US Navy carrier, the Ronald Reagan, which is steaming to this area. And the Chinese have been showing us pictures of Chinese troop deployments in this area and close to the Taiwan Straits. They've deployed heavy artillery there. There's pictures of Chinese military units moving into this area, and there's drills being carried out. And by the way, there are some reports that the Russians, who've declared their solidarity with China over this issue, that they've actually sent a senior military official, a general, to observe what the Chinese are doing, and presumably as a further sign of their support. I can't absolutely confirm that. This has come from some Russian telegram channels. It may be true, it may be not, but it's entirely plausible. So we see military moves by both sides, and that has to be extremely worrying. But so far, nothing has happened. We've not heard reports that Pelosi has actually flown to Taiwan, and we've not seen the Chinese, for their part, do anything of a military nature, or the United States respond in kind. So at the moment, the whole situation is becoming extremely tense, but it's not yet reached danger levels. Anyway, what I wanted to discuss over the course of this program is a comment made by somebody called Wenti Sung on the thread of the well-known blog, The Moon of Alabama blog, one of the most interesting and best geopolitical blogs around, by the way. But anyway, Wenti Sung, who is obviously Chinese and who clearly obviously speaks Mandarin, he gave a explanation of Chinese rhetoric and of the various different stages at which Chinese rhetoric takes place. And he said, I'm going to just pass some of his points. He says that Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson's recent words, China will act strongly to resolutely respond and take countermeasures. Many observers, and we mean what we say, and then many observers took the Chinese use of the words forceful response to mean war, but this person, Wen Ti-sung, goes on to say that forceful or effective can mean war, but not. It doesn't actually suggest that in Mandarin, and that in fact it stops short of threatening war, and that other expressions like "you are standing on the edge of a cliff," which is also being used, also suggests that we're not quite yet at a stage when the Chinese actually are actually threatening military action. But then this person, Wen Ti-sung, says what would be the kind of Chinese expressions that would cause serious alarm. And he mentions this one: if we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? If the Chinese start using that phrase, if we could put up with this, in this case Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, what else can't we put up with? And then this person goes on, Wen Ti-sung goes on to say, this means the perceived provocation from others not only threatens China's interests, but threatens its identity too. The rhetoric invokes the familiar century of humiliation, that's to say that period from the mid-1840s until the 1940s, when China became subjected to a series of aggressive wars by the Western powers, including Russia, by the way, and Japan. So that's the period that the Chinese refer to as the century of humiliation. So if we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? That would suggest to the Chinese, that would remind the Chinese of the century of humiliation and Chinese nationalism rhetoric, narratives, and would signal that China has no room to back down. And it shows a readiness to use very high-level brinkmanship. And this person points out that China used this language before skirmishes with India in 1962 and with Vietnam in 1979. But then there is a further stage beyond this phrase, if we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? And the final, the toughest language that China uses before military action is taken is, don't say we didn't warn you. In other words, the last warning. And again, this person, Wen Ti-sung, says that the Chinese use precisely this kind of language before actual fighting took place with India in 1962, with Vietnam in 1979, and importantly with the Soviet Union in the late 1960s, when there were border clashes between China and the Soviets in the 1960s. Now, can I just make an observation about those border clashes in the late 1960s, the Soviet-Chinese border clashes? What people perhaps overlook about those border clashes is that they were a direct clash between the armed forces of two nuclear powers. In the late 1960s, the Soviet Union was a global nuclear superpower with military forces at that time, which was seen by many people as being comparable in scale and power to those of the United States. So the Chinese in the late 1960s, knowing of this enormous military power that the Soviets had at their disposal, but nonetheless China did already possess nuclear weapons of its own, though in a very, very limited, only to a very limited extent, nowhere near comparable to that of the enormous Soviet nuclear arsenal of that period. Nonetheless, the Chinese were prepared to give make that kind of statement. Don't say we didn't warn you to the Soviets over disputes over the border. And the Chinese were also prepared to engage in border clashes with the Soviet military, some of which, by the way, spilled over onto Soviet territory. Now, these border clashes caused massive alarm at the time, both globally. I mean, as you can imagine, these were clashes between two nuclear powers, one of which was a nuclear superpower. There were fears that the Soviets would retaliate with nuclear weapons. And in fact, there's even a story that has been circulated by Henry Kissinger, which the Russians continue to deny, by the way, that the Soviets actually were prepared to launch nuclear strikes against China, and that they pulled back from doing so when the United States informed them that it would be opposed to such a move. But that gives you some idea of the scale of the crisis in the late 1960s between the Soviets and the Chinese. Now, that puts that crisis of the late 1960s at a fairly similar level to the one that we're seeing between China and the United States today. Except, of course, that China is militarily far more powerful than it was in the late 1960s. It's more militarily powerful today than it was then. It has much bigger conventional armed forces than Russia does. So obviously the military balance between China and Russia is completely different from what it was in the late 1960s. It's also very different, obviously, from what it was with the United States, what it would have been in the 1960s with the United States. So the Chinese in the late 1960s were prepared to take risks, engage a nuclear superpower in a military confrontation. At that point, it was the Soviet Union over something that they considered important to themselves. And we shouldn't assume that now that they're in a much stronger position, they wouldn't be prepared to do the same with another nuclear superpower, which in this case, of course, is the United States. Now, I just want to add something else, which is that, of course, that confrontation between the Soviet Union and China in the late 1960s had immense geopolitical consequences. Firstly, it forced both the Soviet Union and China to seek rapprochements with the United States. The Soviets through the process known as détente, the Chinese through the opening up with the United States, which led to Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1972. So you can see that it led to a major superpower realignment. But it was also, in my opinion, the single most important event in the crisis that eventually weakened the Soviet Union, because the Soviets, after those border clashes, understood that they were facing a two-front war, and they had to reinforce their armed forces to a huge extent in the Far East, which put an enormous strain both on their military and their economic system. Up to that point, the Soviets had been able to concentrate the bulk of their military against NATO in Europe. Now they were in a two-front war, and eventually they buckled. Now, it seems to me that the United States is running something like the same risks as the Soviets did back in the 60s. They refused to give. By the way, the border clashes between the Chinese and the Russians of the 1960s have now been completely resolved. That issue of the border has now been settled. So negotiations did eventually take place between the Chinese and the Russians. And that issue that led to those border clashes has now disappeared. And had the Soviets perhaps shown more sense and goodwill in the 1960s over that issue of the border, if they'd been prepared to do in the 1960s what they eventually did in the 1980s and 1990s, they might have saved themselves from that two-front situation. Well, it seems to me that the United States, by taking the same unbending line, is risking that same two-front crisis that the Soviets did back in the 1960s and which caused the Soviets to buckle. Now, let's go back to the points that Wen T-sung has said about what would be the toughest rhetoric that the Chinese could use. And he says that the penultimate point when Chinese rhetoric becomes toughest is when they say, if we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? And then the final warning is, don't say we didn't warn you. Now, I am not an expert on Chinese rhetoric, but Wen T-sung does appear to be. And I've just gone to an article in Global Times, and I read that Leng Bo, in this article, a gentleman called person called Leng Bo, who Global Times says is an expert from the Institute of Taiwan Studies in the Chinese Academy of Sciences, discussing China's response and saying that there will be a military response to the provocation of Nancy Pelosi's visit. He's quoted by Global Times, which, remember, is the English language newspaper published by the People's Daily, the official newspaper of Chinese Communist Party. Leng Bo is quoted as saying, China was not strong enough during the Taiwan crisis in 1995-96. That's the moment when the United States previously sent an aircraft carrier towards Taiwan, and the Chinese were forced to back down. But then Leng Bo says China was not strong enough during the Taiwan Straits crisis in 1995-96, but didn't hesitate to take a military response. The answer for the current situation is clear, considering its current political and economic strength. And then there's a series of dots after that comment, but which suggests that Leng Bo had some other things to say, but Global Times, the editors of Global Times, decided that they wouldn't publish them, and one wonders why. But then they finish quoting his comments, and we see that Leng Bo finished his comments by saying, if this can be tolerated, what cannot? Let's go back to what Wen T-sung says is the penultimate warning words of the Chinese, that the Chinese would use. If we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? In other words, Leng Bo is now being published by Global Times as using essentially the same words. If this can be tolerated, what cannot? And then we go to the title of this article, and it's an article published by Global Times, and it's Global Times staff reporters. In other words, Global Times' editorial team and its staff reporters. And the title of this article, in which Leng Bo is quoted using those words, if we can tolerate this, what can't be tolerated, the title is, Don't Say We Didn't Warn You. And let's go back to Wen T-sung, the top gear, the absolute penultimate warning words are, don't say we didn't warn you. Now, one has to qualify all of this, because these words, if we tolerate this, what cannot be tolerated, and the title, the headline of this article, "Don't say we didn't warn you." They're not being uttered by the Chinese government. They're appearing in a semi-official newspaper, but one which is very close to the Chinese government and which is in effect its unofficial voice. But nonetheless, there is some distance. And the headline also qualifies the warning contained in those words. Don't say we didn't warn you. It's attributed, and it's attributed in the headline, not in the body of the article, to a symposium of China's top think tank. This is the Institute of Taiwan Studies that Lengbo belongs to. And it says that the symposium of China's top think tank sends classic pre-war warning to provocative Pelosi. Now, this Institute of Taiwan Studies is obviously going to be very tightly controlled by the Chinese government. So we can be sure that its people like Lengbo, are being given the green light to talk in this way. And there's clearly been a positive decision to allow Global Times to publish these warnings. If we tolerate this, what else will we tolerate? That's stage one. Don't say we didn't warn you. That is the ultimate warning. So I can't help but think that though the Chinese government is giving itself some room, some space for maneuver, it's deliberately using this NGO, this government-controlled, Chinese government-controlled NGO, and this very important newspaper to give some very, very powerful warnings to the United States. And these military units that have been assembled by China, of course, are there to reinforce those warnings. Now, I still think that we're not quite there yet. As I said, it's not Chinese officials so far who are talking in this way. They've done it a step further. But they are using this very powerful rhetoric. I would say that I'm very interested to know who Mr. Wen T-Song is and how it has come about that he's just published this very revealing comment explaining to us the hierarchy of warnings that China uses in a thread on Moon of Alabama. Perhaps that's not entirely coincidence that those warnings have appeared on a widely read, on a thread on a widely read blog just before these warnings appear in Global Times. One way or the other, this is looking like a very alarming situation indeed. I think Washington would be wise to heed these warnings. If the United States persists with what the Chinese see as provocations over Taiwan, well, as I said yesterday, all the indications are that the Chinese are now cranking up towards some kind of direct, kinetic military response. They showed back in the 1960s that when China is pushed, it's prepared to take on a nuclear superpower. In that case, it was the Soviet Union. Let's not make the mistake of thinking that they might not do the same this time with the United States. And even if that military conflict, that military clash is contained, as the one with the Soviets in the 1960s was contained, it had long-term effects which were disastrous for the Soviets, and a clash with China over Taiwan would, in my opinion, be similarly disastrous for the United States now. Anyway, that's where we are over this gathering crisis. I repeat again, I do hope that Nancy Pelosi really does think this through again, and the people in Washington do think this through again, and that this recollection, this new this announcement of her itinerary, which does not include Taiwan, does indicate that there's been some second thoughts about the wisdom of this. I'm far from sure, I'm far from confident, but let's see and let's hope that saner counsels, as I say, prevail. Well, thank you for joining me again today. This has been a long video. As I said, there's two crises now to deal with, both at the same time, though I think one should see them as part of a larger crisis. And just to repeat again, you can find us on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, and Telegram, and also on ODYSEE. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the great things there. And last but not least, please don't forget to check your subscription to this video. And if you've liked this video, to press the like button to this, to press the like button for this video too. And thank you for joining me again today, and have a very good day, and more from me soon.